Hi, welcome. If I look nervous during this session, it's because I'm on stage with 3 attorneys. Actually, you're not an attorney. No. The person on my left is Mike Sachs, and I want to introduce Mike to you because he's with the Association for Competitive Technology, and they helped sponsor this. They gave me a big boost, maybe a push too, but when Bill and I were thinking about this back during WWDC, we had dinner with Mike and talked about this, and his enthusiasm was another one of those pushes saying, yes, we should go ahead and do this. So I thought this would be a good time to ask Mike to speak for a minute or so on what he does with ACT.
Thanks, Tim. And I want to tell you, when we were having dinner together, you and Bill were like kids writing a letter to Santa. The vision that you had for this conference was so full of enthusiasm, and my expectations have definitely been exceeded. So this is amazing that you pulled this off.
Yeah.
I build apps for a living, but I'm also part of a trade association of app developers called ACT. And we help each other be successful. And we also interact with the world of politics because a lot of people in Washington and in Sacramento and other places are making laws that affect us very profoundly. Privacy laws about security, your liability as a business. And so we feel that it's important to be part of that conversation. Because if we don't speak up for ourselves, then only the big companies will be at the table, and the voice of small businesses or small app developers will not be heard. So if you are an app developer and you would like to be part of a community where we help each other be successful, please visit ACT's website. Please consider joining. It's free, and I want to tell you a lot more about it, but this content has been so awesome that I don't want to take away from it, and I'll leave the word to the lawyers. So thank you.
So like a lot of this conference, this session is about a question that has been burning in my mind for some time. And rather than describe what the session's about, let me just first tell you a few sentences about the people who are participating, and then you can probably see where I'm headed with this. First, we have Susan Gibbs. Chuck Soper introduced me to Susan and said that Susan is part general counsel, part Ganesh. And if you're a student of, the Indian people laughed in the room because Ganesh is a remover of obstacles. Susan has she worked at Apple and was involved with licensing of iPod technology. She also worked with Dolby Labs, and currently she has a private practice where she consults with smaller companies like a lot of us to help us deal with IP and other issues, and actually in a few minutes she will expand on that. Next to Susan is John Malloy. John is a partner at and a co-founder of Blue Run Ventures, which is one of the most mobile-focused investment firms in Silicon Valley. A couple of weeks ago, or even less actually, there was a story about a company, a Palo Alto Israeli company named Waze, being discussed as a possible acquisition of Apple because of their mapping technology. So John is a board member of Waze. Previously he was involved with Chomp, another Apple acquisition, and he's been involved with Slide, which was acquired by Google, and a company called PayPal that you've probably heard of, and involved with the process of that. Also, he's involved with Topsy, Banjo, and 140 Proof, other companies you may have heard of, probably. And then to the right of John, as well as looking out, is Dan Scheinman. And I discovered Dan after talking with Susan and saying, I really want to have somebody from the other side, from the inside perspective. When companies acquire startups and other companies, what are they looking for? And I said, I'd like to have someone from maybe Google who does mergers and acquisition, or maybe Apple, or just somebody in that space, And Susan opened up and said, what about Cisco? That would be good. They've acquired lots of companies. And the very next day was Saturday, and I looked on the front page of the Mercury News, and there was a story about Dan. And the story was not about him being a former M&A lead at Cisco, which he was head of M&A for several years at Cisco. It was also about his contrarian investment preference to seek out older entrepreneurs. So unlike people like Ron Conway, who says things like he likes them 17 years old, you can derive your own impressions of that. Dan finds value in people of all ages and sees special opportunities in working with people who look a lot like the people at this conference. So I thought he would be a great person to have with us, and thanks to a couple mutual friends, he is here. So before I join them, I want to tell a story. I want to recount a story, actually, that many of you know. In the early years of OS X, Karelia Software made a product called Watson. Watson was a desktop search tool, but you could also use it to search the web. Watson had over 20 custom interfaces for searching recipes, TV, movie listings, stock prices, weather, and more. In 2002, Watson won an Apple Design Award that called it the most innovative Mac OS X product of 2002. But just a few months later, Apple released a program called Sherlock with very similar features, and suddenly Watson was effectively dead. For years after this, Mac and now iOS developers have worried about being Sherlocked by Apple. If we make a new product that's too close to something that Apple wants to make, we run the risk of being squashed by a competing product from Apple. And worse, with iOS and the app review process, many of us worry that if we make apps that improve on standard Apple apps like Mail, our apps would be rejected. But lately, we've seen many new products in the App Store that improve on standards like Mail and Maps. And since Apple bought Quattro in January of 2010, we've seen a few other companies and products get bought by Apple. Later in 2010, Apple also bought Siri. And last year, the app search company Chomp was also bought and disappeared into Apple. So it seems that times have changed. And now for the next hour or so, we've invited these three experts here to talk about Apple, acquisition, and startups. So first, I'd like to get to know Susan and ask Susan if you could just tell us what you can about the time you spent at Apple and also what you do to help startups.
Okay, hi, thanks very much. When I was at Apple, I worked mostly on negotiating deals having to do with hardware, microprocessor, iPod technology, licensing in technology, patents from individual developers, licensing out the iPod stuff to accessory developers, and supporting the stores. And I had come from Cooley Godward at the time, and had done litigation mostly there, IP litigation, which gave me a very deep background into why different parts of the contract of any kind of agreement matter. Even the stuff you think of as boilerplate that nobody wants to read, indemnification, warranties, things like that. I've seen millions of dollars turn on, well, who's going to pay for litigation based on how an indemnification clause is interpreted. And quite often they're not easy to figure out from just reading them, because all of that stuff that you're given in contracts and just told, oh, this is just our standard form, all that stuff really does get negotiated if you have any kind of bargaining power at all. So sometimes the language gets really interesting. You can see that somebody said at one point, oh, let's just make that mutual. So it just doesn't make any sense at all. So I was, let's see, at Apple, I can't tell you too many juicy stories. They're my client. I can't really disclose much about that, but I saw people actually negotiating with Apple and getting much better deals for themselves than they might if they didn't. And quite often, if they had a lawyer to help them negotiate, they got much better terms.
Okay.
Okay. Now I help small companies and developers in those kinds of negotiation situations, often with just basic stuff like, okay, we did all this work and we signed this agreement, we thought everything was going to work out, but the customer has sole discretion on when it's done and when we get paid.
Did anyone do that Google search the other day involving Mike Montero and PayMe? Yeah. So in that talk, Mike talks about how his attorney is someone who makes him money.
Yeah. Don't be afraid to use a lawyer. There are really expensive ways to use lawyers. You go to a big firm, which there's a place for the big firms when you're dealing with VCs, and you'll probably agree they're really the time and place for, like when you're involved in a merger and acquisition, spending $650 an hour on a lawyer can make you money. But there are much cheaper ways to use lawyers for just negotiating deals and making sure your IP is protected and that you own the stuff that you bring to a deal.
Could you give us just one or two ways that that's true?
Sure.
Because I imagine a lot of us are just hearing the $650 an hour and not the part about can make us money.
At one end of the spectrum there's LegalZoom, right? And just the listservs that we have in groups like this where people are saying to each other, well, we're not lawyers, but let's figure out how to deal with this cease and desist letter, and somebody's infringing on my trademark, or I don't know what to do about this. And people just have this tendency to try to do it themselves. I don't recommend that. Even if you're a lawyer and now you're running an app development company, it's probably not your core competency. But there are sole practitioners like myself or small firms that do a lot of technology-related law who have had experience and training at the big firms, have worked in-house at the big companies, who know what is negotiable quite often and how to talk to the people on the other side, or how to write something that will protect you, an agreement. And that can be a really much less expensive way to go. And also there are virtual firms, groups of colleagues of, sole practitioners who have colleagues to refer specialized issues to, whether it's privacy laws, HIPAA, for example. When those issues come up, you don't want to just go to a general practitioner. But solo practitioners, small firms tend to be much less expensive. And now there are virtual law firms where you can, for a small fee, or sometimes for free, ask questions, and numbers of lawyers will take a crack at answering your questions. I don't know how great those are yet. It's a new thing that's being tried out. But if you're really on the cheap, it might be worth a try.
What's one of the obstacles that you've removed in your Part Ganesh role?
Oh. I'll have to work. I'll come back to you on that one.
Okay. In this panel.
Sure.
We'll get that. Okay. So, John, you invested in Chomp, and now you're on the board of Waze. Back to the original statement about being Sherlocked. What's your perspective on being Sherlocked by Apple?
So I'm not, I just have a law degree, but I'm not really a lawyer, but I guess shows I have a degree. I'm going to give a caveat first. So everything I say has nothing to do with any particular company. There may have been a transaction involving a company with the letter A in it, but if I say any more specifically about it, I think my tongue turns black. But I'll try to just give general advice, and I'm definitely not going to talk about anything that's active or that has been rumored to be active. My background is I'm an early stage investor. I really started in the comm space and have been in mobile for a long, long time. My game is to disrupt. I live to disrupt. So everything I say is kind of through that lens. So I have no affinity for any platform. I have no love for Apple. I have no hate for Apple. I have no love for Google. I have no hate for Google. I'm just trying to survive, help my company survive, trying to disrupt what's out there. I live in fear for my companies of being Sherlocked by Apple or being, copied by Google or whoever else, or Facebook. So I think that that's a real fear. I will say that that was great to hear that old story. I think that the one thing in sort of thinking about the evolution of Apple's ecosystem itself is really we actually have an ecosystem, right? I think that in that period of time, I think it was a different era. And so I do think that with their success in mobile, with the advent of the App Store, I think we are in a new era. That doesn't mean that it's a panacea. I have a lot of concerns about it still. I think you should always be paranoid. I think you should always be worried about, are you encroaching upon the platform? But I don't feel that that's different. I have the same view of Apple as I do of all the other platforms.
Well, I think the light that came on when companies like Chomp were acquired is that maybe we can do it better than the big company that we're worried about Sherlocking us.
Yeah, absolutely. So the whole notion behind Chomp was that really seeing ahead of the curve what a disruption apps were. And the founder is just an amazing guy, Ben Keegren. He really was very persuasive in the vision that this was really about a transformation of software itself. And so then we set about thinking, okay, what does that mean? We thought that search, discovery would clearly become a problem. The earlier, the level of personalization that you all drive continues to make and compound that problem daily. So Chomp was all about trying to solve that problem. And what was great about it, it really wasn't about Apple at all. It was really about Google. We were just convinced that Google couldn't do it, that PageRank would not work for discovery of apps, and that in fact is true. And so that's actually what led to the sort of creation of Chomp. And it wasn't actually called Chomp right away, but ultimately we changed our name to Chomp. And then it was actually looking at all the platforms that were in front of us, Apple was the best. And so it's just that's where the takeoff was. Mm-hmm. It wasn't an Apple-specific thing. I was pleased that companies like Apple could, obviously have an appreciation for the tech that was built and the people that were involved. So I was very proud of the company.
So just absorbing what you've said, Chomp wasn't created to be sold to Apple. It was created to succeed versus Google as a competitor.
Yeah. I think that, again, this is just a VC perspective, and a lot of you are indie developers, so it's totally different, and both paths are perfectly fine. But from a VC, if you're going to take VC money, I think that taking VC money for a business that is single-threaded to a particular transaction is really a low probability outcome. And so if you want to try to take more money and grow a company, have a multi-platform strategy. Don't, trying just to build a business to be bought by one company is really, really a lot of risk. It's always so hard to build something that matters and is relevant, and then to be successful in the marketplace. And then if you're wedded to like one potential acquirer, that's, you're running your thread through a lot of eyes of needles in that one.
So we'll move on to other topics, but let me just ask Dan this question on the subject. You spent a few years managing acquisitions at Cisco. What's it like from the inside of an acquiring company? How does a company decide whether to buy a company or to duplicate its products and compete with it?
So I will. Let me give you the overview of the basic overview of what those rooms look like. Usually on the inside, we're sitting down with an engineer who's been working on a project for a long period of time. and we say, gosh, there's this exciting new area. Would you rather keep doing what you're doing or go to the exciting new area? And do you think we should buy, or do you think we should build with you and give you more resources? And of course, 99 times out of 100, that engineer says, invest in me, right? But the job that we had always at, sort of sitting in central government was to say, when is that realistic and when is it not? Because the worst thing, well, you told a great story. I think the other story of Apple is the time that it's launched things and then only to see it get its butt kicked in the market by multi-platform developers who do a better job than what it's done. And so when I was at Cisco, I was the defender of making sure that we don't get seduced by that engineer who wants to do something new and who may say, aha, I think I'm better. Because one of the things that I can tell you at the end of the day is ultimately the better team wins. Right? It's not about the resources. It's not about anything else. It's always the better team wins. And I always wanted to be affiliated with the better teams.
All right, so let's open it up. What excites, this is to the whole panel, what excites you about app making? And what are the most interesting app making opportunities that you see?
I remain extremely excited about the commoditization of technology that mobile's. To me, it's all about commoditization, and so I think that things that leverage the sensors that are already in everybody's hands are still the most interesting thing to me. That's where the scale opportunities are, and so that's actually why Waze was so exciting to me. But I still think that kind of investment, in that case, it was. We're crowdsourcing GPS contributions for a map. That is for me, it was just completely disruptive to the mapping industry. I think that there's other opportunities to just leverage all those sensors that are just being pumped out into the market every week. So I continue to be really excited about those kinds of business models.
Well, so let me just say, it's sitting next to in a room of visionaries. I come later to this world, in fairness, and I have a bias in that I come out of the enterprise for so many years. So take this for what it is. But I actually see, look, the world is becoming where the cloud is the computer, right? To steal Sun's old slogan, and I believe that the app ultimately is going to be critical in the enterprise to figure out how to leverage all of that power that sits in the cloud, and that there's enormous opportunity to disrupt the enterprise and to disrupt that the buyer is going to be disrupted, enterprise processes are going to be disrupted. It's a lot of people tell the story, but it's true, which is that it used to be you join an enterprise, you go, oh, cool, look what I get. And today you go to work and it's like, ooh, here's what I can do at home that I can't do here, right? And soon I think we're going to flip again, and it's going to be all these cool things that we can do because of apps on top of that cloud that are going to create enormous opportunities to disrupt how we work in the enterprise.
Building on what Dan said, and also on what Michael Griffith said, the last presenter, about designing things that, as soon as you get your mobile device, you try to start making it personal. So things that specifically are just there to make your life better. I have 100 and some apps on my phone, so I don't, it's hard to even get around to trying some of them. But the stuff that really matters in my life, I use all the time, and more of those. I want more of those that are specifically for my life, and I think that's going to lead to a lot more adoption. But to answer a different question, I started off as a litigator, so I can answer whatever question I want. I think if you want to be an acquisition target, having a company, building a company where you've got a team and you're doing something that's really exciting as a product, as something that, as John said, is designed for multiple platforms and enriches people's lives, rather than starting off thinking we're going to be acquired. Let's do something that's sexy and fun and get acquired. Really not. Nobody wants to buy a company that's obvious, that's like that. People are looking for acqui-hires, right? Where there's a team that's proven to work together and do interesting things. That's what companies want. I'm thinking.
I'll give you the worst acquisition pitch I ever got. All right, somebody called up and said, "Dear Dan, we figured out a way that we are going to crush Cisco." I was sort of interested in that. I said, "Okay, I'm going to listen to the rest of this message." And they said, we've got wildly disruptive technology. I like that, and we're poised for victory. So we want to sell ourselves to you, but can you please call us back within 72 hours because we're running out of money and we're going to go out of business. Okay, so don't do that.
All right, well, I just see a question on Twitter, and it actually matches the next one on my list. So thanks, Ron. The question is about intellectual property, and it is, when should an app maker invest in patents?
You mean developing your own patents, or licensing in patents, or
I think
buying
we
companies
mean
that have patents?
Invest in
Figuring
filing
out
for
what
patents.
they are? Oh.
When should we make it a point to file for patents and take that money that we could be spending on graphics or user research or Tapjoy paid installs and instead buying patents?
I think that's a seminal question, and I'd actually turn it around. If you're in a business where you really don't think that a patent is applicable, I think you may just have a great app, and it's perfectly fine to do that. But if you're really trying to, build something different, or if you're really trying to, use the app as a channel to a service, I think you almost always should err on the side of at least going through the initial steps of protecting yourself. You don't have to, it's not that expensive to file a provisional, and I think it's, just in case you come across something that's you find that vein and it starts to become really, really attractive to a lot of people, you've at least essentially staked your claim and you have a chance. So if it's obviously an individual decision. It's really about the scope of what you're trying to do. But I don't think of patents as they making your business one way or the other, but I think that they are a really good indicator of value of what you're trying to build. And to the extent that you can actually have a patent issued to you, I always celebrate those. I always think that that's fantastic. I think that's a non-trivial accomplishment, and that I don't think you'll ever go wrong having a patent. Now, having good patent counsel, not spending too much money, how you get there, it's clearly very difficult, but I think I very much err on the side of at least filing. Now, another disclosure, I do have a law degree, which I have not admitted for like 15 years. I'll even admit one more to you all. I actually used to do patent searches to pay, while I was in law school. So I'm a complete intellectual property nerd at my core, so I'm warped on that. But I think that
there's hope for that. We can get you help.
But when you think about what's going on right now, in the sort of broader mobile context, it's not like the internet. It's internet-like, but it's not like the internet, or we've changed the internet. And all the activity that's happening at the macro level in the value chain, where all these people are suing each other, that really tells you that you probably should have intellectual property if you can. Lastly, I would say there's one area that I think is really ripe for innovation that I don't think anyone's addressing. I think there's a huge disconnect in the way that user expectations are being driven by you all with your apps. End users actually think that everything is real time, yet the internet is cached. And I think that there's a lot of innovation algorithmically on the back end that people are doing that, a patent in that area, maybe it's not a sword, but it's a hell of a shield, because lots of other people are solving that problem now too. Lots of big companies are not doing it very well. Lots of internet companies are not doing it very well. So particularly on the back end, I think if you're doing something to create unique sets of data, if you're manipulating data uniquely, I think you should protect yourself.
There's one thing to be conscious of course, and you'll agree with me, I think, is that you have to be conscious of the timing of the publication of your patent, because if you're in a very competitive area like this and you're actually developing something unique, it's not going to be a secret. So you have to time it strategically, basically, your filing.
Yep. That's what I mean. You can file a provisional and you're fine. So at least,
right.
Essentially, it's just putting your deed line down. It's like drawing a line on your property and saying, don't cross this line. Or when someone's crossed it, you come back and say, hey, I own that property.
Even better, yeah, that you own it because you drew that line. It's even better than buying real estate.
And that's
create
not legal
property.
advice for me. I have no right to give legal advice. She's giving the legal advice.
I have a bar card.
Any more comments on this, or I have another related
Patents
question?
suck.
All right, well, we could have a round of applause for that. And that actually is a great segue into my next question, which is, when should I, as an app maker, be concerned about someone else's patents?
Okay, this may be the did I go to law school question, but I'm going to answer this never. And I'm going to tell you that, look, worry about the business first. And ultimately, at the end of the day, patents are only about, they're about money changing hands. They're about what % royalties change hands. And rarely is a patent dispositive in a business. It happens, and I'm sure Susan will give us a case where it happened and it screwed someone up. But in general, it's only about money. And if you don't make any money, no one's going to care. And if you make a lot of money, you can solve the problem. I discovered, I was, mea culpa, I'm still in recovery. I was general counsel of Cisco, and I've enriched the therapy profession because of it. But the thing that I learned was, when we were a small company, nobody sent me letters. I got a lot more friends as we got a lot more we get a lot more attention from people who wanted royalties, right? But at the end of the day, they wanted royalties. They didn't really want to shut down the business. They didn't really do anything that really mattered. So it was just a money negotiation ultimately. And then that gets back to the legal stuff of leverage and all this stuff. And so I'm more aggressive on this stuff of saying it almost never matters. People worry about it. I worry about the business, get money, go forward. Don't worry about the patents.
So there was a time when not a lot, but a noticeable number of app developers were getting letters related to patents. And I think there was a general feeling that, well, we should fight this. But it sounds to me like you're saying pay something and move on so you don't have to waste time on it. Is that the case?
No, ultimately, look, first of all, it's never an issue if you aren't making any money. So if you're getting letters and you're not making any money, right, it almost doesn't matter because no one's going to bother with you if you're not making money.
The response is bite me.
Exactly, right, exactly. That's
not legal advice.
The time you pay and you go forward and you do something is when you're a real company and you've got a run rate and you want to protect and make sure your customers know they're protected and you've got attorneys who are looking at the claims and saying yeah. But for low revenue companies, I just think skip it, right? It just doesn't matter.
How about trademarks? I see people invest in brands and do marketing and start to develop a reputation and then get the cease and desist letter after they're worth something, saying, oh, somebody's registered that mark in that field, and then it becomes an expensive negotiation. So a lot of people don't pay any attention to trademarks because we're all about SEO, right? It just matters, get some good search terms, be findable. And who cares? Well, at some point you have to think about what else is out there and who owns it. And
so maybe some of us know someone, I know someone, who got a letter about an app name and was threatened in that letter and wound up settling by selling the app name. So there's a question from the audience related to this, which is, it's back to our rebelliousness against patents, I think. What can app developers do to protect ourselves from non-practicing entities' patent suits?
Trolls.
Yeah, trolls.
I'm definitely not giving legal advice.
All right. Well, I think I'm hearing just pay them off and move on. And no?
Oh, no, not necessarily.
Ignore them.
Oh.
I agree with Dan's answer. It's kind of, first off, you have to be relevant and survive. And if you're small in your business, there's no issue if someone's threatening you and you're not making a lot of money. There's nothing for them to take. So you're not worth the hassle of them hiring lawyers and everything else.
So it's back
just
to
kind of
Susan's answer.
pure common sense.
Yeah.
I will say I agree with Susan wildly on the trademark stuff. Cisco at one point through an acquisition, we owned the iPhone trademark. And we ended up in a negotiation with a small mobile phone company, Apple, over this trademark. And in the end, we ended up I think we did the deal the Indians did over Manhattan. We gave them a few trinkets and they took over the trademark. But the reality was that that was an extreme situation of extreme leverage that they had. But most of the time, a lot of things can be avoided by simple searching and just not only looking at Google and seeing what's available, but also looking and doing a trademark search. They're not all that expensive. That, I think, is worth investing in. The patent stuff, I think, until you have revenue, ignore, delete, skip, right? Because the reality is most people who threaten to sue aren't going to threaten to sue, aren't really going to go through and sue an entity that doesn't have any revenue unless they're really religious about it. And because the risk to them is if they lose that lawsuit, they're dead, and the risk to them too is that you don't have any money to pay them anything. So what's the point, right?
Is there a revenue threshold that qualifies as any money? Like when you say before you're making any money, you could be a successful app in the App Store, and you could get a letter, and you could say to them, look, I'm making $100,000 a year, $200,000 a year for that app, and I think that's a waste. Probably.
I think you know the answer already. It goes back to that hourly rate you quoted at the beginning.
Yeah.
$600 an hour or whatever. I mean, it's the cost for the lawyers to go after a company.
So it's what it would cost them to go after you. If they couldn't get that, then they wouldn't bother. All right, well, let me try another question about acquisition, and that is, what should an app maker do when an acquirer calls?
So generic advice. I think it's all about creating optionality. So don't get too excited. Or even if you are excited, try not to show that you're excited, no matter what. That's advice for everybody. Say thank you very much. I'll think about it. I need to talk to my wife, partner, coworker, co-founder. Just get out of the room and think about it, because nothing's going to happen right there. Behind the scenes, obviously, if the more options you have, the better leverage you have. So it's always hard to negotiate with guys like him when he was on that side. The only thing that the big companies really respond to is they basically have all the leverage, and so they have to believe that you have a credible alternative versus what they're offering. And so even if you don't have a credible alternative, never admit that you don't have a credible alternative, no matter what the transaction. So create optionality and be thoughtful about it. The other sort of advice for anybody who's in a company that's, say, 5 people or more, be really thoughtful about who gets exposed to the discussion. So if you're a sole proprietor, that's great. But if you've got 5, 10, 20, 50 employees, try to keep it to yourself or to your co-founder. Keep it as small as possible, because it's incredibly distracting to everybody in the company. And these things they don't always go through. They very rarely go through. And you can lose a lot of momentum in your business. So it's hard. It's even hard for you if as you're holding it. Of course, you get excited about it, but you really have to sort of step back and control information and really think about, does this make sense? Do I have other options before I really engage in this?
The only other thing I would add, and I think dead on, everything's dead on, is that if you do have a board, tell your board, because they can actually act as that calm down moment and can help you negotiate. One of the things that we like to do when I was on BigCo's side was to divide the board and management. And so the hope was we get management super excited, but it may not have been the best deal we were going to offer. But once management was bought in, then nothing else really mattered, and so occasionally we would do that. So I think, put your best foot forward, right? And I've got 100 anecdotes about things that John has said about people getting too excited. I've been in rooms where people said, "Wow, we were only expecting half that," right? Okay, thank you very much, right? It's just that urge to have that moment of you've been working so hard to do something and someone comes in and recognizes you. Have that with your spouse or have that with your board. Don't have that, in the room with the other side, because the other side is going to say, okay, now I can leverage that, right?
Now, this might be treading on sensitive areas here, but what if this acquisition inquiry comes at a later stage when there's been some funding and there's some investors who maybe have veto power over any change of control, or who have those kinds of things in their, in the investment that they've made, and that can make things more complicated in terms of making a company more difficult to acquire. Any advice for people when they're talking to investors before any serious acquisition offer is going to be made?
Well, I think actually what Dan said is applicable. I think that if you have a board, you have to let them know. Mm-hmm. You're required to do that. So you can maybe skirt the issue that it's not really an acquisition offer, but the sooner you do that, probably the better. If you have a board that's that dysfunctional, change that now. Because fight about all that stuff before there's money on the table. Like, if that's really an issue that could be applicable to anybody in this room, think about solving that now, because when money gets into the equation, it's not going to get better, right? So be proactive about that. But assuming you have a rational company and a good relationship with your board, I think what Dan said is absolutely correct.
Yeah.
The other thing that they can do is, a lot of times it's hard for, assuming John's the management, it's hard for John to come and say, hey, I've got another offer or whatever, because they feel like they've committed. Whereas your board can do that for you and can say, look, we've got other alternatives, or it can bring in the leverage. So I always think it's good to have someone there who's representing you a little bit more dispassionately, and leave you to, because you're gonna have to come work for me. So it's good to have the emotional relationship, with me, but leave the negotiation to someone who's more, or leave the posturing to someone who's more dispassionate.
And anyone who's bought a car knows exactly what we're talking about. It's the same model. I've got to talk to the manager.
There's a great story that just came out about Bill Nguyen and Lala. And I don't know how many of you saw it, but I think everybody has probably heard about Kohler and the amount of money that Kohler raised. And I think a lot of people's reactions were, how did that happen, when we saw those numbers? And look for that story about Bill, and you'll get some really good perspective on that, because he seems to handle an acquisition offer just masterfully.
Yes, I was in the middle of that, and I can say yes. That acquisition, that process was handled exactly the way you should handle it. I'll give you a contra story, which is, so I got tired of that. And one time in my life, finally, we had the opposite problem, which is there were two companies we liked, and no one could distinguish between them. So we actually held a reverse auction and said, we'll take the lowest price. We don't care. And we dispassionately let the companies bid. And the opening bid was $200 million, and the last bid was 25. And there are certain VCs that will spit if I come anywhere near them, who are involved in that process, right? But usually it's the other way, right? But I've learned constantly, if you can be dispassionate, always wins. Always, right? And you have to be dispassionate in the process, one way or the other.
All right. Someone asked if apps are fundable, or apps are...
Fungible?
No, well, yeah, apps are
fungible.
We're trying not to be fungible as app developers. But let me just ask this. What should app developers expect from angel and venture investors? And
you want to do angel and I'll do
Dan?
VC?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah,
you go first? Okay, I'll go
you
first.
Go first.
So from a VC perspective, there's a wide range of VCs. From my perspective, which is I can comment on, absolutely apps are fundable, but I look at app as a channel, and so I'm proud to have been an investor in some apps that are pretty amazing and have done really well. But the reason that we invested and the reason those companies have done well, it was always about what we were trying to drive that engagement with. It was really about building just a channel to new users and building up a platform. So if you're really trying to build a service, it's a service mentality actually, and that's my background, is I like to build services. So I think if you're really building a service, particularly one that's not episodic, actually to Susan's point earlier, if it's increasingly relevant to people, if there's a lot of touch to the relationship you have with the end user, that's something that's absolutely fundable from a VC. then the question becomes how much money do you need, and you sort of map out, you basically figure out what's your sort of, what's your macro, best case for this, how much cash does it take to get to that, and you back into, what's the right VC strategy, because there's, in this, we're lucky to live in California, there's a wide range of addressable VCs, and everyone's different. So it really has to do with the scope of what you're trying to build and what your cash needs are, but absolutely apps are fundable. The
first thing I funded when I left BigCo was a small app called Tango. And the reason I funded Tango at the time was several things. First, they had an incredibly passionate and committed team devoted to a large business opportunity. As John said, it's not really app. The word app is a channel. It's always about the business, right? And who had disruptive technology, right, around peer-to-peer that was going to make peer-to-peer video really interesting. The economics of it, super interesting. And so the bets that I want to take are around that magic word of disruption. Because I have to go earlier, generally, the VCs will go a little bit later. They get more time to look at what's happened. They have real data. When I'm looking at, generally either the first tranche, which I don't like, or the second tranche, when there's some degree of metrics in the market. There's probably been an alpha done. You can see what's happened, whether people are using it, not using it, what's going on. And so my real bet ultimately has to be on team, market, and disruption, and those are my three factors. And if I can find those three things, that's the magic of when to write a check.
So, are there any more questions? I see mostly comments on the Twitter stream. I don't think we have a roving mic. Could you tweet that, or go ahead? Go ahead, say it. And I'll... I didn't. Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, so I think this has to do with first to file. How about just a brief statement about what first to file means?
I'm not a patent lawyer.
Okay.
I'm definitely not a patent lawyer.
I think we're going to pass on that question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
My question for consultants. You generally have a provision in your contract that says the client owns the code and they produce. So I'm wondering, two questions. How concerned, I think when you're solving a technical problem, it's almost impossible not to use that solution again later. So how concerned do you need to be about a client coming after you and using the work with a competitor later? And is one thing that we've occasionally done is open source the project under our own account and then integrate that code into the client's code. That's a reasonable solution to that.
Well, I'm going to bifurcate my answer a little bit. So what you're really talking about is not just the ownership of the code that you develop for the client, but the residuals too. Like if you come up with ideas and thoughts for new things as you're working on it, who owns those? And how enforceable is that? And those are the kinds of things that actually should be thought about when you're negotiating your agreement with the client. And they rarely are, but that's a really good thing to pay attention to. I thought about this problem because it comes up a lot when I'm helping people with their initial agreements with customers. And I haven't seen a lot of companies going after people for using the stuff that's in their head from working on collaborative projects. But it's a risk. So it's something to really pay attention to when you're doing the deal.
I have one last question, and then if you have any closing thoughts, we'll do that. This one is, what do you have to say about crowdfunding? Do you think that's a positive change or that that's going to lead to problems?
Okay, so I think this is critical. I think the next 12 to 18 months, we're going to find out a lot about crowdfunding, and I think we're in the middle of that. It is clear that crowdfunding has changed the seed world, because I've seen estimates as high as 18,000 businesses are getting funded, and the only reason that can happen is because of the democratization of early stage funding, right? A-round funding has not got democratized. So either one of two things happen. The famous squeeze that some people have written about, and that there's going to be a big squeeze on some of these companies, or the A-round gets democratized and there's a lot more companies who keep going to the next round, right? And I think this next 12 to 18 months will answer it. I think that there's a lot of people who are threatened by it, and there are people who are not threatened by it, who feel like it brings value into the system. I ultimately think, look, it's going to be a reality, and then what we have to figure out is, just as we're disruptive to other markets, we have to figure out how are we disruptive in this market, and how do we leverage this change to make it interesting and make sure that these guys who are crowdfunding have a reasonable chance at getting returns for the money they're putting in.
So I think it's great. As somebody who loves disruption, I think that greater democratization of capital to start a business is a good thing philosophically. But in business, you learn when you're in a business that's going to require other people's money. What you have to always realize is every fundraise sets up the next fundraise. So that I said earlier, you need to think about the totality of the money you're going to need. So if you're in a business that's going to crowdfund, fine. But what's the impact that's going to be on the people that come after that? You actually have to be able to answer that question. You have to have a little bit of foresight in terms of think about sort of the trajectory of your business. So I think it's appropriate for some and maybe not appropriate for others is the short answer. But I think in general, I think it's a good thing. I don't buy into this whole Series A crunch that the blogs have just sort of inflamed. I do think that there is, there's a lot more angel funding and there's a lot less Series A funding, and there's a gap. There's clearly a gap, but it's not the cataclysmic, meltdown that we saw in 2000, 2001. People are just alarmist and they're not really understanding the issues. In
Amen.
general, it's pretty great. And one of the ones that's kind of cool is, VCs are not funding hardware. And, if you've got a cool piece of hardware, I think that's fantastic that you can raise money to when the market's not going to give you money for your business, you have other options. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
And so far, it's been illegal to use crowdfunding to raise money in exchange for equity.
So
but the American Invents Act changes that, and they're due to come out with guidance and rules for how to do it in the spring. So that could open up a new.
And there's also high-end and low-end crowdfunding. High-end crowdfunding these days involves someone with a Russian accent. Low-end is, okay, other things. Is the Jobs Act and little things. But I do think, I think, the thing that is, like everything else, there's opportunity and there's challenge. And I think this represents one of the biggest opportunities if we can figure out how to harness this in a positive way to maybe help the process get better over time.
Okay, let's actually, would you like to just make that as kind of a closing statement? So we were talking about Susan being Ganesh. I think what I'd like to do now is just kind of go down the line and make one statement about why we're here and what we're about and our goals. And I'll start by saying that I think this is an incredibly good time to be an app developer. And we're here, this conference is because of this excitement and the opportunity that I think we have. And that a lot of it is that the market and the way that we can serve people with our apps is growing so fast that we are much more a team than a group of competitors together.
okay, I want to thank Tim for putting together such a great conference. I think he's done an amazing thing. And as Ganesh, I want to encourage people to just find a lawyer who you can work with, who's maybe not not somebody at a big firm to start with, but somebody who will know who you are when you have a crisis or when something comes up where you want to know whether this is a good brand and you'll be able to protect it, or whether it's time to file patents. Somebody that you can call, and quite often you can many questions and calls to your lawyer can be answered. Problems can be solved with a simple phone call to somebody on the other side who sent you a cease and desist letter, or somebody's raised an issue, or somebody's freaking out about something. Quite often things can be solved very quickly and for not too much money. So I want to encourage you to develop those relationships.
Well, I guess I'll just echo what I said earlier, is that I'm here for one thing, and that's disruption. The reason I'm such a crazy person about that is I actually met this guy and worked for him named Bill McGowan, who was at a company called MCI, and we basically broke open the phone system. We funded the internet as it was then. It was a DARPA thing. It was kind of crazy, but we did it. I moved in the early 90s, I moved into mobile, and we finally have kind of overtaken the internet. We've taken control. So what I'm excited about is that the incumbents today are threatened. I think that Google and the internet companies are threatened by the things that we can create in the mobile sphere, that we're redefining sort of the relationship to users, and we're redefining the compute requirements on the back end to basic services. And that's why a company like Google will spend what it spends to just give away an OS. When the most powerful technology company is doing that, they're not doing it out of love. They're doing it out of fear. They also understand the change. And so I'm in it because I think this is the very early days. But 5 years from now, there will be new companies that will be huge and hugely disruptive to the status quo of today. And that, I sometimes don't sleep for days just thinking about that.
As John said, I think we live in one of the most incredible times where there's so much disruption that is occurring. And I want to end a little bit with just a little bit of a pep talk to say, I know what it's like, and it's hard when you're out there and you're hearing no a lot, right? And I would tell you two things. One is always trust what the data tells you, right? So if you see that you're getting traction, or even you're starting to get dollars in, right? Those are by far more reliable indicators than a lot of times what other people think, right? So trust what the data tells you, right? And the second thing is always just remember that a lot of people were, overnight sensations after 2, 3, 4 years, right? And that this is a long battle to get to where you want to get to, and have the partners, the resources, the funders to help get you to that point where you can be an overnight sensation, right? But the other side of that also is be realistic. If you're in the wrong market, if you're in the wrong place, it's okay to say, vector left, right? Vector right. Don't stick with something that's not working. I see that so many times where people become stubborn about something and the data doesn't tell them that it's working, right? And but I think we live in one of the greatest times, and I think because of the shrinking of Series A funds represents the single greatest opportunity for people like me, because there's so much pattern recognition going on, and sometimes folks in this room fall out of pattern, and it means that people like me are going to have more, bigger, better opportunities to find more tangos and more aristas, quite frankly, than we would in other times.
All right, thank you. Thanks, everyone. So at 4 o'clock, we're going to meet the Obi-Wan Kenobi of business plans, Tim Berry. So we'll see you then.